I hope what may be useful as an introduction really to Lindsay's excellent work in Ashford is just a little bit of background about what as I'm sure you're aware, is a very big sea change going on at the moment in our understanding of and practice in street design and the relationship between traffic and towns. And the notion, the label shared space is merely my rather clumsy attempt to try and provide a vocabulary for a change which has been going on in mainland Europe and now in the UK for some time. And I hope one that offers both opportunities and very interesting challenges for landscape architecture and all the other design professions involved in the urban realm. To just start with our thoughts about streets in general, and I've been fascinated by streets since a student. Just to start with a boring street, one that, if you're of my generation, you're very familiar with. But it's an image which I like very much because if you ignore the old ears in the foreground for a minute, the background fills our expectations usually of what most urban and suburban streets consist of two lines of opposing traffic separated by a broken white line. There's a 4 or 5 inch upstand curb which separates the pedestrian zone of the footway from the carriageway. It usually accommodates parallel parking along its line. There's usually standard municipal 8-metre lighting columns which give an even light over the space to accommodate public transport. Clearly defined places where you cross the road, which the 4 are dutifully doing, and a language of asphalt, concrete curbs, and probably concrete or asphalt paving in this case. And the way it's such a familiar image that it's often quite difficult to imagine change. But change is happening, has been happening quite fast in the past decades, and particularly in how best to revisit and reconsider the relationship between traffic and towns. And just to explain a pretty obvious reason that I think underpins this change is, of course, economics. In that for the first time in our history, possibly, one could argue, town centres, city centres, have become redundant in the sense that we no longer need to travel into a town centre or marketplace in order to obtain the goods and services that you need for everyday life. In previous generations, you had to come into town to trade, to acquire buy goods and services information, whether you liked it or not. And if it functioned, if you could accommodate the movement of goods and purposes, that made it work. If there was quality, well, that was a cherry on the cake. And Jan Gale illustrated this with this diagram, where he points out that we were seeing a shift from city centres, villages, town centres, which were functionally essential only a generation or so ago, to being voluntary places that we congregate together because we wish to, not because we need to. You can, if you so wish, acquire all the goods and services you want from out-of-town superstores. You can acquire all the information you want over the internet, even social relationships. So that the cities and places which will survive, in the view of many economists, are those where the intrinsic qualities of the public realm fulfill broader human aspirations rather than merely the functional requirements of the marketplace. And that change, which is happening very suddenly and very quickly, has, of course, huge implications for the importance of and how we configure the public realm, the streets and spaces that make up the public spaces of our cities and towns. I wanted to just start with also an observation that was reinforced by recent retirement of the great Alan B. Jacobs. If you haven't read Great Streets, please give it to yourself as a birthday or Christmas present. Alan Jacobs is often described as the ultimate student of the streets. He's now in his late 80s, professor of urban design at Berkeley University in California. But he observed that if you're interested in the interaction of humans one with another, you have to work on observations, not on assumptions. And I often illustrate that with a picture of an ice rink, in the sense that if you can imagine if you'd never seen an ice rink before, if you'd never had any experience of it, you had no idea how one worked, and somebody comes to you and suggests setting one up in the town, and you say, well, you better describe it to me. And you explain, somebody explains that you flood an area of a couple of sides of tennis courts, and a steel ring around the edge, and then people pay to strap blades on your boots, and off you go. There's no other rules, no other regulation, no other control. Now, your first reaction, if you had never experienced an ice rink, would be, you are completely crazy. This would never, well, this is a nutty idea. It certainly wouldn't pass a local authority's safety audit, I put it to you. But we know in practice from observation that part of the pleasure of ice skating is that you enter into a remarkable relationship with a whole bunch of strangers in terms of coordination and anticipation and behaviour. All sorts of social protocols emerge about which way round you go and where experts and beginners go and so on, how you behave, which would be very difficult to model in an engineering or theoretical sense. So there's a huge gap between our assumptions we make about human interaction and the observations of the complexity that such interactions involve. And this is important because most of the way we configure the public realm, and streets make up the huge proportion, are based on assumptions. That this space on the edge of Kew, I think, somewhere like that, Brentford, is full of assumptions about what is necessary in order to resolve the anticipated interaction of different users and vehicles and traffic. It's also, of course, a space which is full of messages about what we think is valuable and what isn't. The former forecourt of that once rather handsome pub on the left-hand side of the picture it's taken secondary importance to the resolution of movement. And this is important because, of course, the way that as cities and towns seek investment, the way they configure their public realm is hugely important in articulating a series of priorities. And Ashford, as we will see later, this was particularly important. And in a job like mine, where I involve visiting and observing and commenting on hundreds and hundreds of towns, I find that within 5 minutes of the railway station, you can usually pick up 1 million clues about, little details about values and priorities. It's tall bay, but you know what I mean. They're full of meaning about what this place is about, what's important. Now, concern about the decline in the quality of streetscapes has been evident for some time. Often it takes the form of concern about clutter and overload of information. If you live in Guildford, it's always encouraging to know that there's somebody to turn to if you really get down about this. But I'm always intrigued by the way that the foreground of our towns, the immediate details, are often treated, and that I'm not alone in this. In that when English Heritage a couple of years ago published a little document called Save Our Streets, it wasn't intended for wide circulation, but it seemed to hit an enormous popular unlock a degree of dissatisfaction with streets, which amazed English Heritage at the time, that clearly people were concerned about this as a mismatch between the importance of place and the standardized treatment of some of the spaces between the buildings. And I'm also puzzled by this, and I think this schism of the way we treat the built environment is an odd one. And I illustrate this with a series of silly cartoons, but imagine some nice town building, a town hall, a library, I don't know what it is, and some little hoodie, do you call them hoodie? Yeah, little vandal, little shit comes along with a spray can and sprays paint all over this nice building, for whatever reason. And the police come along and nick him, but not before he's badly damaged this lovely building. And the citizens of the town wake up to discover that their nice building's been badly defaced, and there's much outrage and horror, and the press rush in and much concern. Fortunately, the local authority are very efficient, very quick to respond and get on with the business of cleaning the building and repairing the damage and carrying on with the business of responsible government as usual. It seems to me odd that we sort of have accepted that you can put huge amounts of effort into whether you can adapt a window in some building. You have to acquire permission, planning, and listed building consent. The state can vandalize a piece of public space with no permissions whatsoever. I mean, if you think it's odd, I mean, this is, obviously some effort being taken over this building the other way, but the foreground is as if it's another world. It doesn't matter. And I find that's strange. In a way, what shared space is about is trying to integrate that schism. But as you're probably aware, a huge amount of effort in the past few years has gone into rethinking some of the background of streets, with the Manual for Streets and English Heritage Streets for All, and CABE very active in producing case studies on successful and interesting examples of streets, which are now available on the web. But just a few thoughts about the background of streets. Clearly, they have always had to accommodate a number of functions. They're very complicated places. The principal functions, of course, those of, on the one hand, movement, transport, traffic, getting from A to B, and on the other hand, exchange, social interaction of one sort or another, encounters, whether formally for trade or just for information. And I like old images like this because they so well illustrate the two parallel purposes of streets going on simultaneously. And indeed, until fairly recently, most spaces and streets accommodated those different movements in various flexible ways. This is a typical market town in about 1961, and you don't, whilst there's still quite a lot of, by then quite a lot of vehicles and so on, you don't feel that the formidable woman in the bottom right is in the wrong place. You wouldn't argue with her if you did, but there's a sort of pretty informal relationship between the different functions of that space. And of course, even today, you don't have to go very far, particularly in mainland Europe and Italy and Mediterranean towns, to find many streets and spaces that still cope with the different purposes of both encounter and movement fairly successfully. Now, as I'm sure you're all aware, I don't have to, a professional body like this, that in 1963, the government commissioned Colin Buchanan, the Buchanan Report, and his colleagues to advise on traffic in towns. And the report of that year was hugely influential, not only in this country but around the world, in establishing a policy framework for traffic in towns. And the fundamental conclusion of Buchanan was that these twin functions of streets, those of movement and of civic functions, exchange, were fundamentally incompatible. And his recommendations were that they should be segregated in wherever possible. Urban designers and architects and planners and so on should attempt to segregate those two functions. So we have the pedestrian precinct emerges, of course, as part of that. It draws on a longer 20th century tradition, goes back to the Charter of Athens in 1928. Corbusier, of course, talked about, there's no longer any place for the street with its traffic in the brave new world. And in a way, it kind of fitted with the 20th century notion of rationalism, of organisation, of trying to make sure that different functions happened in different places. Traffic in Towns illustration for Tottenham Court Road posited different and less successful models for how to keep the process segregated, different vertical layers for exchange and shopping on the one level and movement on the other. But it's essentially an anti-street vision that really up until very recently was still the mainstay. I mean, the government in the mid-60s enthusiastically embraced this notion. This was the first line of the important roads in urban areas document in 1966. And it chimed with the zeitgeist of the time, the notion that streets should be not so chaotic and muddly and multi-purpose as they were, that maybe children should be more imaginative in finding places to play. And you can still see in many modern designs this notion of segregation of movement and traffic from civic space, absolutely writ large in design. I'm old enough to remember the government sending, the Department for Education, sending to every school a leaflet which had this on the cover, redefining the notion of what the public realm was for children and their parents and teachers. And of course, more famously, the 1985 One False Move poster, which was the one that first got me interested in this subject. It seemed to me a very severe penalty for making a mistake on the street. But of course, what it was doing was reinforcing the psychological as well as physical purpose of the curb as a notional divide between two quite distinct worlds, with different rules which you transgressed at your peril. And that we brought a generation or two up to see the curb as an important boundary that you stopped at, you didn't cross, or if you did so at your peril. And of course it gives us a familiar urban landscape, it could be really anywhere, whereby the public realm ends at the curb, reinforced perhaps by a barrier. If you're lucky, it starts again on the other side, maybe. If you're lucky, you can apply for permission to cross it by pressing a button. But the space in the middle is dealt with by a different bunch of people with different priorities, a different language, nothing to do with the place where that fits. It's the same whether you're in Inverness or Dover. And it's more than a physical divide, it's also an organisational one. The people responsible for the bit in the middle are quite different from the people who are responsible for the bit up to the fence. They have different institutional frameworks, the Landscape Institute and the IHT, whatever the damn things are called. They dress differently. The guys in the middle have striped polyester ties, and by the shirt. These guys have roll neck cashmere, all that other stuff. But the different training, different language, and if they work in the same organisation, and I work in very different offices and rarely have any contact. But for most of the country, they're in different organisations. It's the county council who are responsible for the bit in the middle, and the district council responsible for the bit to the edge. So there's an organisational and cultural split that implicit in the notion of segregation, which goes way beyond physical design. But I mean, in government, for example, the Department for Transport responsible for streets, the Department for Communities and Local Government, is it this week, responsible for the public realm. It's kind of strange. I mean, the street's not part of the public realm. It's odd. But the law, the institutional framework, lobby groups, and so on, all, and the Landscape Institute, I should have put it on the left-hand side as well. Of course, for most of you, I hope, unlike me, you're not sad enough to have to delve into the stuff on the right-hand side of the graph. But if you're not familiar with it, the boring book on the left is probably the most influential single document that determines the experience that we have of most of the streets across most of the country. It's the world's most boring document. I don't recommend it as bedtime reading. But boy, is it important, because all of those other manuals and stuff all flow from this. Engineers refer to it as the Bible. Interesting analogy with religion. I'm interested in religions, and the similarities between traffic engineering and religion are very interesting. But of course, what happens is that what these things do is to try to anticipate and make assumptions about potential conflict and problems, giving us an urban realm, which perhaps this is an unkind cartoon, but I suspect that most of you can associate and think of places that have some of those characteristics. After all, if you enter the World Heritage City of Bath, a place that, this is the view that greets you from the railway station, a foreground full of individual measures which no doubt put in for apparently good reasons at the time, but which collectively create a space which is ironically neither particularly safe nor very efficient, and certainly doesn't reflect the qualities of space upon which Bath's economy crucially depends. It's not, of course, just an urban issue. I mean, anybody involved in rural, with rural communities, the first assumption, as soon as there's threat of increasing traffic, whatever it is we must defend ourselves with signs to give ourselves some protection. And of course, we try to communicate behaviour and rules and so on with each other in a very complex, interesting language. If you were a Martian and came down, you'd be very puzzled by many of the markings out here in the streets. I am too. I have to remind myself, this is from the Bible. I don't know whether you agree with me, but I think this is what all these complicated combinations of signs mean. Tell me if you think I'm wrong. I think this is right. There's now red ones in London, of course, and double red ones, and so on. But it's a very odd way to communicate what we're trying to do. Now, of course, things are changing, and many will know that the places, pioneering schemes like Kensington High Street, particularly, began to posit a notion of a street, even a busy street, with Kensington High Street's case, 42,000 vehicles a day, which had a spatial coherence to it, had a connectivity from the different businesses on either side, encouraged informal movement, and began to posit a slightly different approach to the relationship between traffic and place. And crucial, of course, to Ken High School, a number of things. It's a very subtle design, the use of the median strip for bicycle parking was particularly important. But it's not a street that shouts design very loudly. It's like a very well-tailored suit. It doesn't make much of its design. But of course, what it does is to recognise its place and its context in that particular part of West London. This was the relationship between the street and the entrance to Holland Park, and there is then at least a clear relationship between the two, that it embedded itself determinedly in that particular context, and perhaps most famously and controversially removed by 850 metres of guardrails which previously ran down both the middle and both sides of the street. They were not particularly popular, but it's worth reminding ourselves that the safety engineers recommended against their removal because they said with so many people and so many vehicles you need this separation. Well, the politicians one particular politician, Daniel Moylan, insisted that he would take responsibility and override them, and of course, as I'm sure you know, his hunch was been entirely vindicated. The dramatic decline in pedestrian injury rates on the left, the yellow on the left, the white on the left there. This is the first 5 years. The subsequent 5 years have just come out. I haven't mapped them yet, but they're much more severe than this. And what this touches on is an underpinning of shared space, which is really important to understand. There isn't really time to go into detail, but it's a notion of the importance of risk as a means of achieving safety, of using risk creatively. And it's encouraging that bodies like CAVE are publishing documents like The Value of Risk in public space. And if you haven't read any of his work, Professor John Adams of UCL is perhaps the most coherent analyst of the notion of safety and the importance of risk. And boy, is it important, because if you look at most of the environment, it's a very puzzling approach to risk. This is Birmingham. I guess you should be aware of pedestrians. They're very fierce, the Brummies, aren't they? But isn't that puzzling way to describe space? Surely it's cars, isn't it? Not pedestrians. You should be anyway. But the advisory speed limit, it's kind of obvious, really. That as Adams points out, that if you treat people as if they're completely brainless zombies, what you get is completely brainless zombies, and that the notion of trying to hide or mark out or prevent hazards and risk from being part of our environment is not necessarily a sensible way to attack. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist this one in the States, but we know that signs are anyway a very poor way to influence behaviour at the best of times. It's not something that solely applies to streetscapes. This is a very sad playground in North London. You'll note it's had a safety audit recently. It's had some rubberised matting and some barriers. There's no swings. In fact, there's no children. And when asked why, well, the swings are removed because the children might play on them. And of course, ignoring the reason why children play is because they're exploring their risk boundaries. They therefore need accidents in order to do that process. I promise I won't depress you anymore, but just one. This is a recent Mews, cul-de-sac, in Basingstoke. Don't ever go to Basingstoke, please. But this is crossed by a very pretty quiet pedestrian and cycleway. And clearly the local authorities had a bit much money at the end of the financial year and has had a risk audit done, a safety audit done of this thing. Words fail me. What do we really treat people as such idiots? I mean, do we not think that people will bicycle around that? No, thousands and thousands of pounds of money, precious public money, is going on a misunderstanding of risk. And it seems to me it's important. If you observe a Sainsbury's car park or a campsite or anywhere where the usual rules are not in place, it's not that people don't know how to behave. On the contrary, the more you remove that regulatory framework, the more the social protocols take hold. And we know exactly, if you're a driver in this space or in a Sainsbury's car park or news court, how you behave and how you interact, because your mind shifts from the regulatory framework to the social framework. And this is important because it describes the only single important slide I have for you this evening, is that the qualities that make the highway work well, motorways, trunk roads, railways, if you like, anything that is, that they are single purpose and predictable and highly regulated by the state. We accept the strictures of police and so on to use them. That's what makes them work well. Are exactly the opposite qualities which make public realm work well. From Jane Jacobs onwards, observers of the public realm have pointed out that the qualities that make good public realm is not heavily regulated by the state. It's constantly unpredictable. It's constant changing, highly flexible, and we use an entirely different communication with one another in the public realm than we expect from these simple repetitive signs and markings on the highway. Both of these worlds are important, but it's very important in design terms not to confuse them. And boy, do we often see confusion, that most of our edges of the towns represent a mixture whereby we're overlaying two entirely contradictory principles upon space. It's neither good public realm nor good highway. It's also just worth noting, and this is important in the context of speed, is that increasingly psychologists point out that the way we think in space, the way we record time passing, depends on where you are. And we all know this from your own experience. If you're held up, as I was yesterday, for 5 minutes on a train or a motorway, those 5 minutes feel absolutely agony. Half an hour. You're distracted for 5 minutes in the pub with some friends in the marketplace. 5 minutes goes in a flash. In other words, our brains respond to the notion of time passing in different ways. And this is vital because when you're designing or creating a street, you're creating a time framework. And that will in turn relate to speed. So that the decision, for example, by this family to hold this guy's 80th birthday party in the street affects the time framework of that street. I mean, the drivers would pass by occasionally, I won't know this photograph, but none of them felt their time being robbed by having to just pause while somebody edges their chair in a little bit and they ask that little boy, wish him happy birthday or whatever. But when you're designing streets, you're designing a time framework. And if you're ever interested, if you come across this book by the mad Australian David Enwich, it describes very well how you can influence traffic speeds through other means than the usual language of traffic calming and speed bumps and cameras and signs and regulation and all that stuff. Speed, of course, is terribly important because, and I won't go into this in any detail, but that there are qualitative changes that take place within what appears to be our human evolved speed. That the human, we evolved millions of years ago, 100,000 years ago, to cope with running speeds up to about 22, 23 miles an hour. A modern fit Olympic runner goes about 24 miles an hour. And that there appears to be, if you map the disbenefits of speed against whether it's fatalities or comfort, there's a kink in the graph that occurs at around about 22 miles, somewhere around there. Whereas there appears to be a qualitative change in the relationship that we have with our surroundings. And I think that's not surprising when you talk to evolutionary biologists. This is terribly important because as we move into an era when the demographic change, the number of elderly people, whether we wish them to participate in the public realm, whether you're old or blind or whatever it is speed of traffic above everything else. It trumps by everything else about whether that space is accessible. And if you accept the notion of design speed, then what we push into space, whether it's what elements we use there, whether it's bollards and so on, or indeed road markings, centre line markings I'm puzzled by, are crucial indicators about whether this is highway or whether it's public realm. As you probably know, a lot of authorities, Wiltshire, Norfolk, Devon, a few others, have been experimenting with the removal of road markings in order to change the speed and time framework of streets. And it's something that the Dutch and Danes have tumbled to years ago, that you can create a speed and therefore time context by the relationship between the context and the street. Now, nobody explored that more effectively than the late Hans Monderman. Many of you may have heard of him. He spoke a couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago, at the City Hall just before his death in January of last year. But he, as a traffic engineer, you can tell by his tie, but he was head of road safety for the provinces of Friesland, and he, extraordinary man. He really observed very carefully how traffic behaved in certain contexts and how you could exploit the clues of designing context, and he began to explore what would happen if you took away, as he did in Machinga, every trace of the usual signs and road markings and signals that dominated the speed, and discovered to his own amazement and delight that it didn't make any difference at all to the ability of traffic to negotiate that space. On the contrary, by linking by sort of getting the street to integrate fully with its surroundings in the detailing and the relationship between pub and church and green, building streets where the architecture and the surrounding landscape are absolutely seamless. You can't tell any difference between them at all. Even down to, in the case of Machinga, a well-loved copper beech tree happens to be a landmark for the villagers there, so it's sort of recognised in the way the street paving recognises the shadow lines of that tree. And just a simple language of linking buildings, having a conversation between buildings and activities in a street, the notion that a high street can still serve its traffic function perfectly well, but a church has a space in front of it, or in this example of his, he extended the shadow lines from the buttresses across that street, so that you cannot drive past that church without being absolutely intimately engaged with the context of that particular space. The streets, I'm sure, the more complicated spaces he tackled later in his career, complicated junctions, five-way junctions, this one at Oosterwolde, not brilliant urban design, but a very effective way to allow the movement function of that street. It's not unusual to see parties of people standing around in the middle having conversations. I believe this was the Kent study tour, but the local authority, I think, employed this old boy to walk back and forth just to keep it safe. And this notion of re-understanding safety is useful when you think about this late scheme of Mr. Mondeman's. This was a typical example of a primary school with a playground between the school and the busy street that you enter the village. And for years they've been concerned about the speed of traffic entering the village and passing the front of the school. Now the conventional response would be you build a bigger wall or fence between the school playground and the street, and you get the children some other way and you separate them out. Hans Mondeman recommended that you extended the school playground across the street so that you drive into this town through the primary school playground, minimising the barriers between the two. And it's the scheme which has been in place for a couple of years now, and it completely turns on its head the notion of what's happened there quite, but the computer's crossed, but about how you handle this relationship, so that, as he argued, the children are going to have to understand and learn about traffic, and boy, does it affect driver behaviour to drive through that street. One of the most exciting schemes that is now on site and may happen this year is the rebuilding, the redesign and reconfiguration of Exhibition Road in West London. It's certainly the most ambitious single street project that the UK has seen, and I think will offer a glimpse of what is possible that's the sort of trial of the markings that was going on last year. The London Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, of course, leading the way on some of the application of these principles. But the reason I like it, when the Times published proposals, leaked the proposals for Exhibition Road, they published this little cartoon on their cover, and I like it very much indeed, because in a way what shared space represents is an important shift in the relationship between the state and the governance of the public realm, and passing responsibility from the state to communities and to individuals. And that's a shift which has very, very broad ramifications, I suspect. So that I hope that, that if I can leave you with misquoting the Beatles, there might be a chance for us as a design professions, architects, landscape architects, to do it in the road. So, thank you.